Hello again. Remember our 5 keys, which help us to learn more about how God saves people, how God deals with people. And the first key took Barry, remember, to meet Sergeant Major Totes, and we learned about the doctrine of total depravity. Things are much worse with us than what we could ever imagine. And the second key took Barry to meet Uncle Dixon in the fairground. Remember him? And we learnt about the doctrine of unconditional election, which means that if anybody's going to get saved, they're going to need help totally from outside. God chooses his people and calls them to himself. It's not about what they can do. And so today we're going to find out where key number 3 will take Barry. Here we go, chapter 3 of Barry and Blunderland. Sorry, chapter 4, because we had an introduction. Chapter 4 of Barry and Blunderland is Ted and Toni, in which Barry is surprised by a secret benefactor. Barry had had a really tiring day in the fairground. Remember, he's on the train. The train came for him. He got in it. He didn't know where it was going. But the seat was comfortable, surprisingly, and he sank back into it. In the railway carriage, he started staring at the view of the sun going down over the fields of waving corn. He felt drowsy, and the rhythm of the train rocked him into a deep and long sleep. When he woke up, it was light, and the train had stopped moving. It was very quiet. Barry stood up, stretched his little green arms and looked out of the carriage window. The train was now standing at a little station. It was a pretty little station with tubs of geraniums and green painted seats, but there was not a soul around. The name of the station was there on a big sign. Washam by Sea, read Barry. And there was a poster. Welcome to Blunderland's Riviera. Barry felt quite excited about this. Was he at the seaside? He looked for the handle on the door, but there wasn't one. He had a moment's panic, and then he remembered that in these old-fashioned kind of trains, the handle was on the outside. So he slid down the window and peered out. At once he heard loud cries of seagulls, and he smelt the tangy smell of seaside. He was very small, but at full stretch he could see and just reach the handle, and he tried to push it down to release the door, but the handle wouldn't turn. He was just too small. Oh no, what to do now? He took another look at the inside of the door. There was no handle on the inside, but right at the top there was a keyhole next to a sign which said, "For the use of authorised personnel only." Well, he was authorised, wasn't he? Hadn't this train been sent for him? And had Uncle Dixon said something about him being chosen? So pulling out his key ring and standing on the seat to reach up, Barry tried inserting the 3rd key, the middle key, into the lock. It fitted. It was really hard work trying to turn it while standing on tiptoe at full stretch. But finally the key turned in the cylinder, and there was that reassuring click as the pins in the lock shifted. Then the door swung open so fast that Barry toppled out of the carriage onto the platform. Only just managing to pull out the key from the door. He was sure he was going to need the other 2 sometime, so he put the keys safely back in the pocket of his shorts. The little station was indeed quite deserted. It felt as though it was quite early in the morning, Barry thought. And actually, being small and green, though perhaps not quite as sticky, he was quite happy to not see anyone. He was not a pretty sight, he knew that. Wonderfully, the station was right next to the beach, and what a beach it was. Barry joyfully ran onto it and looked around. In front of him and to his left and his right was a vast stretch of sandy beach and no one on it. The tide was going out. The sea, with its white-crested waves breaking gently on the shore, looked most inviting. Barry hesitated only for a split second. Then he started pulling off his trainers and socks, his t-shirt and short, and his pants as well. It was so nice to get them off. They were all green and mucky. He hadn't got his swimming trunks with him, of course. But there was no one about, so why not? Totally naked and bright green, Barry dashed to the shoreline and plunged into the sea. The freezing cold water took his breath away. Barry gasped and jumped up and down. He ran farther in with lots of splashing and then started to swim around. He wasn't bad at swimming and was happy to try a few strokes and keep moving as he got into deeper water. He was warming up now. This was brilliant fun, as long as he kept moving, which he did. Barry was so engrossed in his swim that he failed at first to notice what was happening on the beach. But when he looked, he was somewhat horrified. A coach had pulled up in the car park next to the beach, and out of it were pouring a whole host of school children. Disaster! Now he wouldn't be able to get back to his clothes without being seen, green and stark naked, by these children. And because the tide had gone out more, his clothes were a long way away from him. Mostly submerged and hiding behind a big rock some way from the shoreline, Barry watched to see what would happen. There he is, you see. The children were gathered round their teacher and each being given bags. Then they were sent off in all directions looking for things. Were they collecting shells, Barry wondered? But then he saw they were actually looking for and collecting rubbish, litter that careless tourists had left behind on the beach. Good job. People were disgraceful, the way they left empty crisp packets and plastic bottles on beaches. The children gave shouts of glee every time they found something. They were having fun. Then Barry, to his horror, saw a couple of children standing round his clothes. They were pointing and laughing and holding their noses. How rude! One of them picked up his t-shirt and held it between his fingertips at arm's length and then dropped it into his bag. No, thought Barry. The rest of his clothes, his socks, his trainers were similarly dealt with. Barry wondered about shouting out, but he was embarrassed to own those disgusting clothes as his. He just gaped open-mouthed in horror, peering round the rock, and he did not dare to move. Just then, from the top of the beach, the teacher blew her whistle, and the children gathered round. Barry could hear or guess what was being said. But what he saw most of all was that the rubbish bags, including his clothes, of course, were collected and put on the coach, and the children were lined up in pairs, and then were led, jostling, laughing and ambling, up a path which led to the cliff above the bay. When he was sure they were gone out of range of sight, Barry swam to the shore. The waves and the wind were stronger, and he was tossed about a good bit in the foam. Back on the sand he stood up and discovered to his immense joy he was green no longer. His skin, head to toe, was back to his normal colour. That was the good news. The bad news was, of course, that he was absolutely bare, and his clothes had been collected up as filthy rubbish, which Barry had to admit they probably were. But they were clothes, and now he was naked. What should he do next? Then he had another terrible thought which really worried him. The keys! They were in the pocket of his shorts. He had lost Dr. Cowell's keys. Now he would never get home. For the second time in this adventure, tears began streaming down his face. But there was no time to feel sorry for himself. There was a train pulling into the station and people were getting off and they were heading to the beach. He needed cover while he tried to think what to do. He ran as fast as he could up the beach. The school coach was still there in the beach car park, but it was empty and locked. But crouching behind it, at least, Barry could stay out of sight while the day trippers headed for the beach with their deck chairs and sunbreaks and buckets and spades. Other people headed off in the other direction to a small parade of shops and cafes on a promenade the other side of the station. Barry considers his options. Should he wait for someone to go for a swim and then steal a pair of shorts? Risky and not a good idea. Too many people about and their shorts would all be too big for him anyway. In the other direction, on the prom, there was a row of largely unused deck chairs. Perhaps he could head for those. His idea was to hide underneath them while he worked out how to get some clothes. So when the crowds had moved away a bit, he made another dash to the line of deck chairs and dived underneath. Just before a family rounded the corner to walk the prom, he found that, small as he was, under the cover of the deck chairs, he could crawl a little way from under one deck chair to another. He wanted to see whether the shops on the parade opposite might have some clothes he could beg, borrow, or even steal. But did he dare just waltz into a shop stark naked? There would be awkward questions which he wouldn't be able to answer. He might get arrested. He was in a proper pickle. Then Barry saw on the pavement opposite something that might afford a temporary solution. It was one of those wooden advertising boards which stand up like a letter A. He was still pretty small. If he could force his head through between the hinges, he could walk up and down and not look too indecent. People might not realise he had no clothes. So choosing his moment, he made his next dash and somehow forced his head up so that he could stand up wearing the board which rested on his shoulders. It was like wearing a kind of wooden tabard. This is how he looked. See? Because he was small, the board covered all it needed to, and Barry began to nonchalantly walk up and down the parade. Some people gave him a queer glance, but most ignored him. There were plenty of peculiar sights in this street, and lots of people dressed up as Mickey Mouse or the Prime Minister or the Queen were giving away flyers, invitations to things, money off vouchers for local shops. There were probably about 20 shops in this parade, the usual ones, cafes, newsagents, shops full of beach equipment and tacky gifts, but, and this was a bit odd, Barry thought, there were a lot of clothes shops. One of them was called Never Better. Another was called Stitched Up. Most of them were advertising the fact they had a sale going on, 70% off, 80% off. People were pouring into these shops looking for bargains. Barry stood outside. Unless the shops were giving stuff away free, they were no good to Barry. He had nothing. You might even say he had less than nothing. But Barry noticed that most people who went into the shops all excited came out disappointed, muttering stuff like, "Not as good as it was cracked up to be. Absolutely nothing in my size. Still ridiculously expensive." Barry was totally out of ideas. He had even started looking in litter bins to see if anyone had thrown away some clothing he could use. But you can't wear a sandwich wrapper. He looked down at the advertising board he was wearing. He couldn't even remember which shop he'd taken it from. It was tricky to read upside down, but it had a picture of a tape measure, a needle and scissors. The shop was called Sorted Limited. Bespoke tailoring. Underneath it said, "Clothes made just for you." Out of curiosity, and because he had nothing better to do, Barry hunted for the shop. It was right at the end of the parade, the very last shop. It looked old-fashioned, maybe a little bit forbidding. It had no posters announcing mega bargains and super sales. As he stared in at the window, A red-cheeked young woman with a head of thick blonde hair piled up on top of her head, but also falling down around her ears and chin, was manoeuvring the tailor's dummy, trying to fit a dress on it. She had dressmaking pins in her mouth, but when she saw Barry, she beamed and waved and dropped the pins to call, "Oh, there you are, come in." Now I'm for it, thought Barry, as he turned and stood at the door of the shop, ready to admit his folly and apologise. The door was pulled open, a peal of bells sounded, and the young woman said, "We wondered where you'd got to. Come in, do." Struggling through the door, Barry entered a comfortable shop with walls of varnished wood fittings, glass-fronted drawers from floor to ceiling, various labelled socks, vests, underpants, shirts, blouses. There were shiny polished cabinets and cupboards, and a shiny counter behind which stood a tall man in a black suit with slick black hair and a tape measure round his neck. He stared at Barry in disapproval. There they are. But the woman pulled Barry in and pointed him to a chair, peacock green upholstery and very comfy looking. "Come in, duck," she said. "Sit down." "I can't sit down in this," said Barry. "Well, let's have it off you then," said the woman. "Come on, you don't want to be wearing that thing longer than you have to." "The thing is," said Barry, "I can't. You see, I've got nothing on underneath." "That's it, ducks. Well, you've come to the right place, haven't you? This is Sorted Limited, bespoke tailoring. Clothes made just for you. Don't worry, I won't look. Ted will find you some undies to make you decent, won't you, Ted? That's my brother Ted behind the counter. He looks a bit scary, doesn't he? But he's just very serious about his work. He knows his business. He'll guess your size of underpants just right. I'm Toni, by the way. Ted and Toni of Sorted Limited. Bespoke tailoring, you see. This is just the right place for you." Ted had turned and opened one of the glass-fronted drawers and found some pants. He gave them to Toni and she put them into Barry's hand. "Now I'll lift off the board." "Goodness gracious, however did you get this thing over your head? It's funny what desperation will do, isn't it? You get your arms inside the board and make yourself decent with those pants. I'll fetch some pliers. Otherwise I might be doing you some damage." It's surprising how comforting a clean pair of pants can be, especially for a boy who had been through all that Barry had been through. Barry allowed Toni to wrench the board apart, and finally Barry was free, not properly clothed, but so relieved. He was led to the big peacock blue chair and he clambered onto it. "Here, duck," said Toni, who had appeared with a tray with teapot and cups. "Have a cup of tea. Ted, where are the biscuits?" "Oh, not those, the chocolate ones. The boy needs pepping up." "You're very small, aren't you, dear?" "The thing is," said Barry. "Oh, is there another thing?" asked Toni. "Yes, you see, I have become very small, smaller than I was. But I've been washed clean in the sea from all the green goo. I need some clothes, but I can tell this is a very expensive shop and I haven't got any money to buy clothes. I've lost everything and I've made a complete mess." "Well now," said Toni with an understanding smile, "isn't it good you're not green anymore? Ted will measure you up for a suit. He likes to do it, you know. And he makes a lovely suit, does Ted. No other customers today, so it looks like it's just you." When Barry had drunk his tea and eaten 3 chocolate biscuits, Ted stood him up on the counter and measured him. Measured his chest, his waist, his hips, his shoulders, his outside leg, his inside leg, and Toni stood beside, writing down all the numbers as Ted measured. When they had finished, Ted and Toni both looked at the measurements. "An unusual set," said Ted. "I'd better check again." So he checked again, but the measurements came out the same. "Look in the book, Toni," he said. I've got an idea. Toni had already pulled a big book from under the counter. So have I, she said. This is very exciting. And she turned the pages one by one and ran her finger down a list of names next to a set of measurements. I found them, she said. They are unusual measurements. Is your name, by any chance, is it Barry? Barry nodded in astonishment. Then we have the suit for you, ducks. We already have it. It's in the back room, all finished. Beautiful it is. I remember that one, all ordered and paid for. It's got your name on it, just for you. Ted had disappeared into the back room and brought out a suit. It looked a really strange outfit to Barry. There was a white shirt and a black bow tie. There was a black tailcoat, trousers, and the shiniest black shoes. Ted and Toni helped Barry into the clothes. They were not as uncomfortable as they looked, and they fitted him perfectly. When he looked at himself in the mirror, he hardly recognised himself. There you go, ducks. The new you, said Toni. Barry was speechless with astonishment. How could there be this suit just for him, made and paid for? But he didn't want to admit it, but he was also quite impressed with the way he looked, this new rig out, and he expressed his thanks over and over again. But where would he go dressed like that? And there was another niggling problem. I don't suppose you've seen any keys anywhere, have you? Said Barry. I had a set of 5 keys, and I think they might be important. But they were in the pocket of my shorts, and... Now then, said Toni. I run a sideline in lost property for the town, and Gary, the coach driver, brought in these this morning. And from under the counter, Toni triumphantly produced a bunch of keys and waved them under Barry's nose. Would these be the ones by any chance? That's amazing, said Barry. Thank you so much. But who ordered and paid for these clothes? Was that Gary, the coach driver? Now, ducks, said Toni quite firmly. Me and Ted, we just take the orders and make the suits ready for collection. If the money's paid, we don't ask any questions. The transaction's complete now. You've been kitted out. We've had our money, and it's time you were on your way. We're about to shut up shop for the day anyway, and you are all dressed up for a party. You'd better get on your way. Out the back, I should think. They'd wonder what had hit them on the parade. And with that, Toni showed Barry into a large room behind the shop, full of all kinds of suits of clothes and outfits hanging on rails and labelled, waiting for collection. While Barry walked up and down the rails, touching and admiring them, Toni slipped away. Barry walked to the end of the room where there was a door. Hello, he said. I think it might be time for key number 4. Ted and Toni take us to the doctrine, sometimes known as limited atonement. All it means is this. If you have come to Jesus as a guilty sinner and asked for mercy and for his forgiveness, you can know that Jesus actually died for you on the cross, and that the price has been paid for your sins specifically. It's a bespoke service, you might say. God is satisfied with what Jesus has done in your place. And while Jesus has taken your sins, past, present, and future, and died for them, you get to have his righteousness, like Barry's new set of clothes. It's the new you. No one who has trusted in Jesus will be lost, because God has organized the whole package. As the Apostle Paul wrote in his letter to the Galatians, he said this, I live by faith in the Son of God who loved me and gave himself for me.